"Stephanie, you've been at this for a while now. Mrs. Novak won't be pleased with us," said Jim, smiling at his daughter, who was fussing in front of the mirror. At just 5 years old, she carried herself with an unusual level of seriousness, which brought a constant smile to not just her father's face, but also to her caregivers. Mrs. Novak, her kindergarten teacher, would say that in all her years of experience, she had never seen such a unique child. Sometimes, Jim would come home tired, desiring some peace and quiet, but Stephanie would immediately sit down next to him and ask a question that she'd been contemplating for a while. "Dad, why do we dream?" she asked one day as soon as Jim settled on the couch. He smiled, sat her on his lap, and replied, "That's an excellent question, my little smarty. We dream because our brain never stops, even when we're sleeping, and it creates small stories and pictures that we see in our dreams." But Stephanie wasn't satisfied. "But why do we have different dreams? I dreamt about a princess, and Johnny from kindergarten said he saw himself on a spaceship." "Each person is unique, and we all have different thoughts and desires. Also, our brains show us things we learn during the day. That's why we have different dreams." "But what do brains do when we're awake and not dreaming?" And so it continued, until Jim completely forgot that he'd wanted to lie down with his eyes closed in complete silence just a few minutes ago. Ashley, Jim's wife and Stephanie's mother, sometimes said, "You know, dear, our daughter frightens me at times. Her reasoning is way beyond of a 5-year-old, and her questions sometimes leave me at a loss." Jim would just chuckle. "Honey, but this is a good thing. Look at her. She's only 5 and she's already won an award for creativity, as if she's in school." It was true. Jim and Ashley were very proud of their little girl, and always paid attention to her wishes and opinions. In general, people around them, their friends, never ceased to admire Jim's family, holding them up as an example to all. It seemed as if nothing could break their strong bonds. However, as it usually happens, even in seemingly perfect lives, unexpected challenges and problems arise. Jim was lost in thought and almost drove past the kindergarten. He had plenty to think about. His beloved wife Ashley had been acting strangely over the past few weeks. She seemed scared, avoiding eye contact, as if she was hiding something from him. When asked if everything was okay, she would respond in a way that quickly changed the subject. It couldn't be that she wasn't telling him something, whether it was a small mishap or a big problem. They had always had a relationship based on trust. Jim and Ashley met back in university. They were both rushing to their first lecture and accidentally got stuck in one of the old, not very reliable elevators. Ashley was pressing the emergency buttons with hope, but nothing was happening. The young couple had to call their friends to notify the authorities. All they could do now was wait for help to arrive. It was unclear how long it would take, but they didn't get disheartened and started to joke around. Jim picked up an improvised microphone and with a presenter's voice began. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special episode of our TV show, where we're stuck in an elevator and have the most fascinating stories for you." Playing the role of a host, Jim asked Ashley, "How do you feel being here?" Ashley, who was on the verge of claustrophobia-induced panic attack, broke into laughter. It was clear that Jim's resourcefulness had somewhat relaxed her. Sensing she was still panicked, Jim himself answered the question in a feminine voice. "Oh, it's quite a romantic place for a date, but I'd prefer a rooftop restaurant." They laughed at the joke and continued to chat. Half an hour flew by like a couple of minutes. Finally, the elevator started moving. Jim and Ashley were free, and with a smile, they realized that this incident had led to a memorable encounter. From that day on, they became good friends and always reminisced about this amusing story. However, soon, Jim began to see more than just a friend in the beautiful girl. He admired her beauty, was in awe of her actions, and felt happy to be around her. It took him a while to confess his feelings, fearing that if she didn't reciprocate, he might lose their friendship. But it couldn't continue like this. One day, Jim decided to take the leap. He asked Ashley for a walk. She was surprised to see him holding a huge bouquet, but what impressed her even more were his words about being in love with her for quite a while. That day, Jim learned that she had been harboring the same feelings for him. They laughed and agreed from that day to keep no secrets from each other. They dated for a long time and got married right after graduating. They planned everything ahead and had Stephanie. Next on their plans was to open a small organic food store They were saving money, and by the next year, they were supposed to start making their dream a reality. He loved Ashley, adored his daughter, and would do anything for them. At the same time, he knew Ashley would do the same. That's why her recent behavior alarmed and saddened him. He occasionally thought that Ashley might have another man, but he instantly dismissed such thoughts. It was too painful for him to even contemplate the past. Jim didn't want history to repeat itself, didn't want to relive the horrors of his parents' relationship. His family, the one he was brought up in, the one everyone around him considered perfect, was anything but that in reality. He vividly remembered that day as if it was yesterday. He had come home early from school because he was suffering from a throbbing headache and the teacher had allowed him to leave. Upon entering his house, he immediately heard the loud voices of his parents. Nervously, he walked into the living room and arrived just in time to witness his father hit his mother. She was knocked back onto the couch from the force of the blow, letting out a soft groan of pain. His father, with an ominous look on his face, moved toward her. Jim, without thinking, threw himself in between them. "Leave Mom alone!" was all the young boy could shout, holding back the tears that were threatening to spill out. The idea of such violence was so foreign to him, he simply couldn't comprehend it. His father paused in front of him, fists clenched. "She is to blame for everything. You'll understand this soon enough." But Jim didn't flinch. He stood there, between his mother and father, meeting his father's gaze unblinkingly. His father just waved him off and walked away, leaving his mother in tears. She cried, clutching Jim close to her, muttering incomprehensible words. Occasionally through her sobs, Jim caught phrases like, "I'm sorry, and you'll understand someday." Indeed, he did understand what his mother meant, but only years later. What followed was a painful divorce. His father, Walter Douglas, had a lot of connections. In court, he managed to gain custody of Jim. Furthermore, his father's lawyers painted his mother Natalie in such a negative light that the court barred her from coming near her son. In court, his mother wept, gripping his hands tightly, but Jim just stood silently, not moving and not meeting her gaze. Walter told him that their mother had betrayed them, that she had another man, and that she had chosen him over them. The realization was painful, deeply hurtful, and bitter. As Jim grew older, he started to understand that things were not as simple as he had thought. His father was a cruel man. When he was small, he saw but did not attribute importance to many things. Frequently, his mother had bruises and cuts, which she would explain to him as accidents due to her clumsiness. Jim couldn't recall a time when his mother openly voiced her opinions or challenged his father. In recent times, she hardly ever smiled, except when she was alone with him. One day, while rummaging through old stuff in the storeroom, he came across a thin notebook. It revealed many events and circumstances of his mother's life. The moments she couldn't bear to keep inside were poured out in this written confession. From what he read, Jim deduced the following. Natalie, his mother, had endured her husband's harsh treatment with fortitude, always striving to be a good wife. From the beginning, she felt indebted to him. Early in their married life, Natalie had noticed Walter's despotic traits. He never tolerated objections, controlled everything in the house, forbade her from working, restricted her social interactions, and could lose his temper for any reason. The primary cause for his anger was jealousy. He was suspicious of every man around his wife. Natalie always believed that if he was jealous, it meant he loved her. Then Jim was born. His young mother transferred all her love and care to him. It all happened when she ended up in the hospital following yet another scandal stirred by her husband. Understandably, she didn't share the real reason behind it with anyone. Due to complications, she had to stay in the hospital for around 10 days. During this time, she was cared for by a young doctor who turned out to be sensitive, kind, and responsive. He showed interest and care for her, setting her apart from the rest of the patients. And so it happened. After a long period of neglect, lack of tender attention and care, she became fond of this man. Initially, it was just innocent interaction. The doctor periodically called her, citing the need to monitor his patient's conditions. He gave professional advice, asked her to take care of herself. Then, during one of the follow-up visits, the doctor invited Natalie for coffee. Gradually, everything evolved into a romantic relationship. The man urged her to leave her husband and come to him as soon as possible. He even offered to confront her husband together. However, Natalie insisted on handling the situation herself. She didn't want to deceive Walter, but was fearful of his reaction. She also worried that her young son wouldn't understand. Nonetheless, she finally decided to confess. However, she could never have imagined that her husband would find out about everything much earlier, and so the inevitable happened. Jim now clearly understood how difficult it was for his mother in their home. He missed her and often asked his father about her whereabouts, only to be met with shouts. He resolved that once he became independent, he would definitely find her. But just as he turned 16, his father gave him a letter. It revealed that his mother was no more. Her sister had asked for Jim to be brought to the funeral, because Natalie missed him and kept repeating his name on the deathbed. However, the letter had been sent 2 weeks earlier. At first, Jim thought it was due to a postal delay, but then realized his father had deliberately held the letter back, making it pointless to attend. Jim never forgave his father for this act. As soon as he turned 18, he left his mother's diary in front of his father and hastily left the family home. After that, he didn't see him, only occasionally calling to check if he was okay, but their conversations never extended beyond formal inquiries. Neither man found the right words for each other, and their strained interaction always ended there. "Dad, didn't you forget we're heading to the daycare?" Jim snapped back to reality and stepped on the brakes. "Sorry, Stephanie, I was lost in thought." Stephanie raised her index finger. "Dad, you can't zone out behind the wheel, especially when there are kids in the car." He smiled. "Yes, I know, sweetheart. I promise it won't happen again." Stephanie, satisfied with the response, got out of the car. "Mrs. Novak," Jim signaled to the caregiver, who, nudging Stephanie towards the door, approached him. Stephanie was complaining about Daniel picking on the girls, and it seems she's planning to set things right. Could you please keep an eye on her? Jim bid her goodbye and headed to work. He had a tough day ahead, and in the evening, Ashley was picking up Stephanie. After breakfast, Stephanie, seeing Daniel, decided to settle their scores. Daniel was ready for the confrontation, and it escalated into a serious fight. By the time Mrs. Novak, the caretaker, could intervene and separate the two, the little girl had received a scrape on her nose. The injury was minor, but it upset her. "Let's go to our nurse. She can have a look," suggested Mrs. Novak. Stephanie agreed. She didn't want to look unattractive. Misty, the nurse, gave her a kind smile. She was only 3 days into this job at the daycare, but she was absolutely loving it. The work, the staff, and the children. "What's your name?" Misty asked. "Stephanie," the girl replied, studying the young nurse carefully. "And I know you," she added. Misty smiled. "Is that so? And from where?" "Your picture is in my dad's wallet." At this, Mrs. Novak raised an eyebrow, and Misty blushed in surprise. She didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment. She couldn't imagine whose wallet her picture might be in. "Stephanie, that can't be right," Mrs. Novak objected. "It's true, it's been there for a long time," Stephanie insisted. Misty looked helplessly at Mrs. Novak, but the older woman pursed her lips and looked at her with a hint of hostility. Mrs. Novak had always been a strong believer in family values and fidelity, and she immediately suspected Misty of having an affair with Jim. That evening, when Ashley came to pick up Stephanie and heard about the fight from the daycare teacher, Stephanie said, "Mom, Mrs. Novak didn't tell you everything." "Oh, what did she leave out?" Ashley asked, smiling at her daughter. "We have a new nurse, and her picture is in Dad's wallet." Ashley dropped her bag. She must have heard wrong. "What? Are you sure? That can't be true," she stammered. "It is, Mom. Haven't you seen it? Look, there she is." Stephanie pointed out Misty, who was leaving the daycare building and heading for the bus stop. A young, tall, beautiful woman. Ashley's heart clenched painfully. Scary thoughts began to flood her mind. She had been anxious, unsure of how to discuss certain news with her husband. Now, it seemed, there was no need for that conversation. She had assumed that this news would be significant to Jim. She had been gathering courage to tell him that she was pregnant. Despite Jim enthusiastically describing their future life together, Ashley did not want to follow their planned path. She really wanted this baby, and it seemed that this baby would be wanted only by her. Stephanie noticed the change in her mother's mood, but wisely kept quiet as they silently made their way home. Jim came home late from work. Oddly, Ashley didn't greet him. This had never happened before. Even when he returned in the middle of the night, his lightly sleeping wife would always stir and rise to meet him. But this time, silence. It only confirmed to him that something was off in their family. This needed to be addressed. His head swarmed with a hive of wild thoughts, and his heart was heavy. Quietly, he got into bed, aware that Ashley wasn't asleep. She was pretending to sleep quite convincingly, but he chose not to acknowledge it. He would wait until morning. If Ashley didn't want to talk now, he would respect her silence. But come morning, they would get to the bottom of this, whatever it was. They always figured things out, together. Morning came, and he woke up to the sound of commotion from the kitchen and his daughter's disgruntled voice. Blast! He had almost overslept. Stephanie was already pumping in front of the mirror, inspecting her scratch, while Ashley was in the kitchen. He walked in and sat down next to his daughter. "Sweetheart, what happened to your face? Don't tell me you ended up fighting with Daniel after all," he asked, letting out a sigh. "But now he will think twice before picking on anyone. Dad, how long will this scratch stay on my nose?" Stephanie looked up at him, clearly upset. Jim gave her a warm smile and gently kissed her on the nose. "Well, now it will heal much faster." He glanced at his wife. "Right, dear?" Ashley instantly turned to him and said sternly, "Jim, we need to talk." "I was about to suggest that. Let's talk," replied the man, still smiling, but doubt was already creeping into his heart. Ashley gave him a long look, then abruptly got up, ran out into the hallway, and returned with a clear file. "Here, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this, where to start. I was scared of how you'd react. Anyway, I'm pregnant." Jim beamed for a moment, but quickly realized from his wife's expression that there was more. "I'm not planning on terminating the pregnancy. Yes, we didn't plan for this, but that's not important now. I know about you and your nurse." Taken aback by this unexpected twist, the husband blinked in confusion. "I don't understand. Repeat that? What nurse?" "What nurse?" Ashley rolled her eyes. "Oh, Jim, stop the charade. I've always trusted you. I thought you'd never betray me, but now I feel like a complete fool. How could you? As if it's not enough that you're cheating on me with a nurse from the kindergarten. Stephanie also said that you have her photos in your wallet. I've seen this girl, young, beautiful, at least 10 years younger than you. Of course, I guess I'm just not that attractive anymore." Jim closed his eyes and massaged his temples. His head ached from the overload of information. The joy of finding out he was going to have a baby was overshadowed by the context in which the news was delivered. What on earth does the nurse, who I've never even seen, have to do with anything? "Honey, are you out of your mind? Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me? And I don't have any photos in my wallet." He bolted from the room. He brought back his wallet. He opened it. It contained credit cards, documents, money, a family photo of theirs, and behind it, a very old picture. "Here, the only photos I have are ours and Mom's, that's all." Then Ashley and Jim exchanged a look, and then in unison said, "Stephanie, could you come here?" Their daughter came into the kitchen and gave her parents a strange look. She was scared. She'd never heard her mom and dad shout at each other like that. "Stephanie, what photo were you talking about?" The little girl pointed to the picture in her dad's hands. "This one. It's our nurse." Jim and Ashley got dressed in 3 minutes, and within 5 were speeding in their car towards their daughter's nursery school. Truthfully, Jim couldn't understand how this could possibly be. His mother was dead, and that girl was very young. Ashley went to drop their daughter off at her group, to then join Jim. He went straight to the medical section. Misty looked up in surprise as a grown man stormed in. "Hello? Can I help you?" "Apparently, I need your help," he said, catching his breath after the run. "I'm Stephanie's father." Misty suddenly remembered yesterday's incident. She felt extremely uncomfortable under the long, hard stare of the man. She was already standing up to escort the man out, but froze when she heard him ask, "Excuse me, was your mother's name Natalie?" "Yes." "What does all this mean? And how do you know my mother?" The girl was utterly confused when the man suddenly broke into tears. His hands trembling, he pulled an old photo out of his pocket and placed it in front of her. He wiped his wet face with the back of his hand and softly said, "She's my mother too." It seemed the man wanted to say more, but he just sank into a chair. not taking his eyes off her. Misty sat down too, the pause stretched on. The two of them sat in silence, looking at each other. Finally, Misty was the first to speak. "But how? How could this be? I thought I would never meet my brother. I had given up all attempts to find you." Upon hearing her last words, the man perked up. "You were looking for me? So Mom told you about me? How much did you know?" "Very little. Just your name, and later your address. But when I got there, I found a family who knew nothing about the previous owners." Just as he was about to ask more questions, there was a knock on the door, and his wife Ashley and Mrs. Novak walked in. Mrs. Novak clicked her tongue disapprovingly and gave Misty a chilling look. However, Jim didn't notice this as he quietly said to Misty, "This is my wife Ashley. Ashley, this is my younger sister." The women stood in stunned silence. The corners of Ashley's lips raised ever so slightly, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Now that all the misunderstandings had been sorted out, they had the opportunity to talk. Jim had a million questions which he unloaded on his newfound sister. She smiled and began to tell her story from the beginning. Misty had been a bright and curious child. Her childhood was spent in a picturesque small town, surrounded by loving and caring parents. Her father worked as a doctor at the local hospital. Her mother managed their home and cultivated beautiful flowers in their garden. Misty loved watching her mother hum a gentle melody while tending to her garden, her face radiating absolute happiness. In the evenings when the family gathered for dinner, her father would always scoop Misty up in his arms and spin her around, her giggles filling the air. Then they would sit at the table, engaging in lively conversations over a delicious meal. However, sharp-eyed Misty occasionally noticed her mother drifting away in thought, recalling something sad and shedding tears when she thought no one was watching. When Misty asked about how her mother met her father, eager to hear the love story of her parents, her mother would only share bits and pieces, often stopping mid-sentence. She always skipped over the parts of her life before she met Misty's father. One day, while searching for a doll in the attic that her mother had put away the previous summer, Misty accidentally stumbled upon an old dusty box hidden behind a stack of books on a shelf. Inside the box were photographs, one of which featured a boy, strikingly similar to herself, in her mother's arms. Surprised by her discovery, she rushed to show her mother. "Mom, look what I found!" Misty placed the worn-out photographs in her mother's hand. Her mother took a glance at them and gasped, abruptly sitting down on a nearby chair. "Where did you find these, Misty?" "Up there in the attic. But who's this boy, Mom? He looks so much like me." Struggling to find her voice, her mother examined the photograph for a long time. Finally, she looked up and whispered, "The boy in the photograph is your older brother." After learning about her mother's history, the little girl hugged her and asked why she hadn't spoken about it earlier. Her mother gently stroked her hair. "I was always scared that if I told you about him, it would make your life harder. I wanted you to grow up in joy and love, not knowing sorrow and pain. But I couldn't imagine how wise my little girl has become, how grown up you are now." That was the first and last time Misty heard about the existence of her brother from her mother. Soon after, her parents were involved in a car accident. The driver of the oncoming vehicle had lost control. Her father managed to survive the crash, but her mother, despite fighting for several hours in the hospital, couldn't make it. Even after all these years, it was painful for Jim to hear about his mother's death. He asked Misty, "What happened next? How did you live?" "Next? After that it was just my father and me. We managed to get through the dark times, supporting each other. He did everything and more to ensure my happiness. Therefore I didn't ask him about you, fearing it would cause him pain. However, when I turned 18, he told me himself. He thought I had a right to know. Your father is a good man." "Yes, he is wonderful." Jim and Ashley sat in silence for a long while. Then Jim said regretfully, "Just think about it. We've wasted so much time." But Ashley, sitting next to her husband, placed her hand on his and gently squeezed. She looked at Misty with warmth. "Let's not regret the time we've lost. It's up to us to decide how we use the time we have now. Let's act in a way that we won't regret anything in the future." That evening, the couple invited Misty and her father to dinner before they carried on with their own tasks. Later the same evening, they gathered again at a restaurant. Misty's father, Alan Piper, turned out to be a very pleasant, cultured man. Jim watched with admiration as he displayed tender care for his daughter, his eyes warm as he watched her and looked after her needs. However, the more Jim observed his sister, the more a certain thought crept into his mind. Misty, of course, was very similar to their mother, but her green eyes speckled with gold differed entirely from their mother's gray ones and father's brown ones. They were the exact same as Jim's, and as someone else's. "Mr. Piper, may I ask you a question?" He approached Alan when the women, along with Stephanie, went to freshen up. Misty's father looked at him and smiled. "You have been watching me all evening. I would be the last fool if I didn't realize what you wanted to ask. And yes, the answer to your question is yes, it's true." Jim was taken aback. "Have you always known?" "From the very first day. After all, Natalie told me immediately, and I would have figured it out over time. But Misty doesn't know about it." He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and continued, "If you're planning to tell her, please choose another time, not today. Of course, don't worry about it. Thank you." In Jim's eyes, Alan became even more worthy of respect. After all, he treated Misty as his own daughter, even knowing she wasn't biologically so. He provided her with a good upbringing and always gave her unconditional love. Jim looked at Alan, and his heart warmed with the knowledge that this man had provided his mother with at least some happiness in her life. Jim was profoundly grateful to him. The next day, for the first time in many years, Jim wanted to speak with his father. Walter grumbled as he rose from his chair and made his way to the front door. He was surprised that someone was knocking on his small apartment's door. The only visitors he usually had were food delivery couriers, and he was not expecting any orders, so he approached the door with a certain amount of caution. "Who's there?" "Please open the door." "It's me." A stunned Walter thought he heard the voice of his son. Perhaps his deep sense of guilt and desire to reconcile with his son, coupled with his inability to make the first move, were leading to such hallucinations, he thought. He took a deep breath and opened the door. In front of him stood a tall young man looking him in the eye. It really was Jim. Unable to say anything, the older man simply stepped aside, allowing his son into the apartment. Jim immediately started to ramble, not looking at his father. "Dad, I was scared that if I didn't come today, I would regret it later. I have something to tell you, and we need to sort out our relationship once and for all." "I'm sorry." "What?" Jim looked at his father and saw so much remorse and pain in his eyes that he was taken aback. He had assumed his father would argue with him in his usual stubborn, uncompromising manner or ignore him. But standing before him was an aged, hunched man with once bright green eyes that had lost their sparkle. At a single glance, it was evident that this man had been drowning in despair for years. "Please forgive me for everything, son. I owe you and your mother so much. I regret everything. How I wish I could make things right, but I fear that even if I were to live my life over, I would act just as I did before. It was only the long days of solitude that made me realize how wrong I was. I thought about calling you so many times, but I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear me. God, I'm such a coward." Jim stared at his father, who could now not stop the torrent of words he had been holding back all these years. This conversation was a long-awaited moment for Walter. Jim heard sincere words from his always stern, arrogant father for the first time. He hadn't imagined how much it would stun him. "Dad, I had no idea," he sighed. The father looked at his son with deep concern in his eyes. He knew that he had spoiled many things in their lives. "Son, you hate me, and I understand you." "I don't hate you, Dad, and we definitely will talk about this. But right now, I want to say something else. If it weren't for one circumstance, to be honest, I don't know if I would have come to see you or not." Jim faltered a little, then blurted out, "Dad, you have a daughter." Walter abruptly stopped and for the first time seemed to ponder. His heart skipped a beat and he asked to sit down. Jim told Walter everything. His first desire was to meet Alan. By the next day, he was already sitting across from him. Walter nervously fiddled with the button on his shirt sleeve. Sitting opposite Alan, he broke the lengthy silence and began to speak. "I've hated you all my life. I considered you the vile man who stole my wife." He then looked around and saw photographs of Misty. Slowly, tears began to form in his eyes. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hold them back. Alan sat quietly, offering a weak smile. "It's okay, Walter." Alan slowly rose and walked over to Walter. He took his hand and gave him a strong embrace. Walter sobbed even more and said, "Forgive me. Thank you for everything. Thank you for raising my daughter and for becoming her real father." "Natalie never spoke ill of you, and she never held a grudge. She only remembers that you once saved her," responded Alan, his words only serving to break Walter's heart further. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," was all that Walter could repeat. Meeting Alan was a true revelation for Walter. He saw in him a man who, despite all the hardships of life, remained committed and caring. Walter realized that this was the kind of father and husband Natalie and Misty deserved. Someone capable of giving them love and support. Someone he himself could never have been for them. Walter decided not to disturb his daughter and shatter the beautiful world in which her father was Alan. It was a difficult decision to make. He did not consider himself worthy to be called her father. 6 months had passed. "Misty, why is it taking so long?" Misty was holding Stephanie on her lap, flipping through the pages of a picture book. "Jim, calm down. This isn't your first time becoming a father." "Not the first time, but this time it's different." Misty smiled. She knew the reason, but Ashley had strictly forbidden her from telling Jim. The door swung open, and a nurse stepped out. "Are you still here?" Jim looked at her with wary eyes. "Don't worry, everything went well. Of course, the boys are a bit weak, but that's normal when it's twins. Everything will be fine by tomorrow." He blinked. Once, twice. Misty stifled a laugh into her fist. Jim gave her a stern look. "You knew? What a sister you are!" He then sank into his chair. "So what you're saying is, I have 2 sons?" The nurse nodded. "Exactly. Looks like your wife had a surprise for you." Jim offered a silly smile. "Life is indeed full of surprises." He sprung up, wrapping everyone in a group hug. 2 sons! Wow! After returning home, the entire family hosted a grand dinner. When everyone sat down, Alan looked at his watch and stood up. He asked for everyone's attention and began to speak. "I'm glad we're all here. I'm very happy for you. Jim and Ashley, I apologize for the decision I made. I invited your father, Jim." He looked at Jim and everyone fell silent. Alan hesitated. It had been difficult to keep the little truth from his daughter. He was very concerned about how Misty would react. "I know he once caused Natalie a lot of pain, but he has changed and repented. We need to be forgiving and give him a second chance." Walter entered the room. Misty smiled and looked at him, but her smile vanished instantly. She stared at him intently, and slowly the realization dawned on her. Misty took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on Walter. She was silent for a moment, letting the revelation sink in. The room was heavy with tension. Everyone watched as Walter moved closer to the table. His eyes were watery, full of years of regret and longing. "Hello, Misty," he said quietly. Nobody said anything. The room was silent, and everyone was waiting for Misty's reaction. "I'm so sorry," Walter said, his voice barely audible. Misty felt a lump in her throat. Misty began, but words failed her. Walter seemed to understand. He offered her a sad, small smile, nodding as though he had expected this reaction. "Take your time, Misty," he said. "I've waited this long. I can wait a bit more." After that night, the family's dynamics slowly changed. It took time, but Misty eventually grew comfortable with Walter's presence. There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, but they worked through them, strengthening their bond day by day. Jim and Ashley's 2 healthy boys brought joy and chaos into their lives. Stephanie adored her new brothers, and the family thrived. Walter became a regular part of their lives, always a bit distant, but making an effort to be there. He had lost many years, but was determined to make the most of the time he had left. As for Alan, he watched with contentment. He had raised Misty as his own, and loved her unconditionally. Now he had the satisfaction of seeing his family complete and at peace, knowing he had made the right decisions.